Hello and welcome to the Kim Iverson Show. So we are coming to the end of 2023. We actually launched this show on Rumble at the very beginning of this year. The first show was actually Monday, January 2nd. And though it was a bit clunky in the beginning, we eventually sorted it out. Do have a great staff here, great producers working on the show. It's a team of three of us, so it's a small production, but we have made it work. And this has been a tough year. It was really hard for us to get this show going. It was in the beginning not that easy. But we did sort it out, and now I feel like it's pretty much smooth sailing. And we're very excited that we're going to be here on Rumble for a few more years, is what it turns out at this point, and hopefully maybe even longer than that, but for a few years for sure. So really, thank you for being with us. Thank you for watching this year. And really very grateful for your viewership. Those of you that joined from the beginning, those of you that joined later on, thank you again for being here. So tonight, what we've decided to do, and I'm kind of dressed up like it's New Year's because I'm not going to see you on New Year's Eve. So this is kind of the New Year's Eve for the show, because the next time we come back, it'll be New Year's Day. So tonight, what we've decided to do is a year in review. We do have some clips of sort of like predictions that I made throughout this year on the show. Now, some have already happened. Some have yet to happen. Some we hope actually don't happen at all, to be quite honest with you. Now, there are 5 in total that we're going to show you tonight, ranging from wars to elections to even CBDCs and cryptocurrencies. So with that being said, let's get started. Silicon Valley Bank collapsed after widespread industry panic caused a run on the bank. Now, try to put your disdain for elitist Silicon Valley censor czars aside, and let's take a look at the bigger picture of what's happening, because it's incredibly frightening. Essentially, the government is seeking to gain greater control over big tech, which will ultimately mean greater control over us. Now, we've seen what was revealed in the Twitter files, how the government infiltrated the big tech platform to censor Americans. We've seen how rollouts of things like ESG scores are being used to force companies to comply with a certain agenda or else. Now, the government seizures of Silicon Valley Bank and subsequently the Signature Bank of New York should set off loud, blaring alarm bells. Over 90% of tech startups bank with Silicon Valley Bank. And interestingly, Coinbase, the largest crypto exchange in the U.S., just announced mere days ago its move to Signature Bank of New York. And then the government seized it. You want to control someone? Control their money. And do you know what the government blatantly states they want to do? Control big tech and control crypto. Coincidence? It's important to understand that Silicon Valley Bank was not insolvent. It was illiquid. There's a difference. Illiquid means it couldn't come up with the cash customers demanded at that very moment. And the reason they couldn't was because suddenly about 20 to 25% of the money the bank managed was being demanded by customers all at once. Now, no bank in America could handle that sort of demand. Any bank would go under in the event of a run of that magnitude. Unlike the banks in the 2008 crash, SVB didn't invest in risky assets or make bad loans with its customers' money. It actually did one of the least risky and supposedly safest things you could do with excess customer cash. It bought treasury bonds. Treasury bonds are guaranteed if you wait till maturity. Now, lots of banks hold bonds. In fact, the Fed recently encouraged banks to buy them rather than lend customer cash in order to get cash out of the system and into reserves in hopes it would reduce inflation. So many banks bought bonds. The Fed encouraged them by giving those banks who did what the Fed asked favorable status. Don't make loans or investments with customer deposits. That would just inject money into the system, causing further inflation. Instead, buy bonds so that the money is tied up somewhere else, which would then reduce inflation. Well, it tied up the money all right. On top of giving the Fed their customers' money at the behest of the Fed then raised interest rates rapidly. That meant that those bonds were no longer worth what the banks paid for them. Now, that's one way to discourage a bank from coming along and cashing them out. Suddenly, Silicon Valley Bank needed that money back, but the bonds the Fed sold them were now worth less because the Fed devalued them. And the run got started because billionaire investor Peter Thiel saw the bank was over-leveraged in bonds and called companies in his portfolio to strongly suggest that they bail out and bail out fast.
Now, the bank actually would have been okay if the run hadn't happened, or if the Fed actually did what the Fed was supposedly created to do, which is help prevent bank runs by injecting liquidity into a solvent bank when too many customers are demanding too much money all at once. The Fed injects liquidity into solvent banks all the time to help them out when needed. One question we should be asking is, why didn't the Fed do it for this solvent bank this time? Why did the Fed let this solvent bank fail? Again, it wasn't because this bank made risky investments or bad loans. This bank bought bonds, lots of them, from the Fed. Now, the Fed has the power to pick and choose when to help a bank and when to let it fail. And this was a bank with good assets and great clients. In fact, the biggest banks, the very banks who are the shareholders of the Federal Reserve, coveted the clients of SVB for a very long time and wanted nothing more but to gain Silicon Valley's business. And now they can, because Silicon Valley Bank is gone. Now there will be further consolidation of smaller banks into the larger ones, making it all that much easier to roll out a central bank digital currency and social credit score for us all. Again, you want to control someone, control their money, and that's ultimately the end goal. So yes, what I'm telling you is the wiping out of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank of New York look more like controlled demolitions than banks that went under for making bad investments in U.S. Treasury bonds. What are they saying about those bonds? Now, I get it. We don't want to bail out banks, and insolvent banks should absolutely go under. And if bad actors are involved, they should go to jail. But let me assure you, this wasn't a bailout, nor would it have been if the Fed had just stepped in and prevented the run. Taxpayer money has nothing to do with this, nor will any of that cause inflation. That talk is just distraction from what's really happening. The consolidation of smaller banks into the bigger ones, attempting to force the most powerful and threatening entities like tech and crypto into banks under the thumb of those ushering in a very specific global agenda. And in turn, if you can control tech and control crypto, you can control the people. The Federal Reserve is a profitable private bank. Without printing new money or going to Congress for cash, it can buy and sell assets such as bonds from banks, and it can lend its money out at any time. It has the power to inject liquidity into these two banks without creating any new dollars. It just chose not to. Instead, they chose to let the banks fail, but kept their valuable clients afloat. Again, why? Because they want to move those clients. Where? To the bigger banks. Why? Because if everyone, especially the power players, are in the biggest banks, they can better easily be managed. This isn't about wealthy Silicon Valley liberals getting bailed out by the middle-class taxpayer. This is another attempt to control big tech and crypto. There was another way. The Fed chose not to do it. They also know everybody would get lost in talk about bailouts and liberal elites. The optics of bailing out Silicon Valley Bank would be horrific. No one would want that. But they didn't want to, and they didn't. That wasn't the plan. Now, you can bet small banks are going to go under one by one with assets and accounts to be absorbed by the biggest banks. You just wait. They're just going to do it systematically rather than through chaotic runs. The goal is to consolidate all the banks into the hands of a few, making it much easier to enforce ESG scores and create a central bank digital currency. And when that happens, they gain a lot more power, especially if they're controlling big tech and crypto. And that is the goal. And there wasn't much of a democracy at all after the Euromaidan. And even to this day, Ukraine continues to essentially just be as a puppet operating on behalf of the United States. I want to show this tweet. This is a tweet that I got a lot of crap for when I put it out there into the world one night when the war broke out. And I just thought, wow, this is just, no one should fight this war. I mean, we should just let this go. And I said, Ukraine shouldn't fight back. No one should let it go. And I followed up with this other tweet to clarify what I meant. If Ukraine fights back, it will be devastating and the outcome won't be any different. They can't fight Russia on this. No one can. Best to let it go for now and use democracy in the future. Don't kill yourselves, seriously. And a lot of people, unfortunately, did die. This tweet was made fun of. And now where are those people? Now where are those people after all these Ukrainians are dead? And the outcome is no different. The outcome is no different. Should have gone and used democracy. You just heard it there. Richard Haass saying, well, we can use other means to try to get Russia to give that territory back. Right, democracy. You use democracy to get those territories back. If the people in those regions want to be back with Ukraine, they will push back on Russia on their own. We don't need to babysit those people. They will figure it out. And they already did. They decided for the last 10 years that they didn't want to be under Ukrainian rule, that there were some far-right nationalists who were very much involved in that uprising 10 years ago today. Those far-right Banderites who were very much for Ukrainian nationalism and wanting to eradicate any sort of Russification of Ukraine, Ukraine being heavily Russian on the eastern side of the country. And a lot of the nationalists wanted to eradicate that. And so they were part of this uprising. They were a large part of it. And that continued, that ended up creating a civil war inside of Ukraine between the Russian-speaking ethnic Russians in the, or at least those who identify more with Russia and definitely speak the Russian language in eastern Ukraine, and those who are in the west of the country. So, this is the 10-year anniversary of this, of Ukraine being used as sort of this puppet. On this day, though, to commemorate it, which is called the Dignity and Freedom Day in Ukraine, so they've made this a national holiday, and so they're celebrating this. And to commemorate this anniversary, a slew of Western leaders either went to Ukraine over the last day or two or issued statements to pledge support. Here is Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. Here's what he has to say. He was there visiting.
It's great to be back in Kyiv. This is my third visit to Kyiv as Secretary of Defense. My second visit since the war started. I was here in April of 2022. Since that time, the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, which, as you know, is a group of about 50 nations that work together to provide much needed security assistance to Ukraine. That group has roared into action, and we have continued to work together to provide much needed security assistance. I wanted to reassure the leadership that the United States of America will continue to support Ukraine.
But in what capacity, we don't know, right? So we'll continue to support Ukraine. I don't think there's any denying of that. Ukraine will remain a sovereign nation. Parts of it, the parts of it that Russia has annexed, will continue to be annexed by Russia, even when Ukraine is pushed quietly towards a negotiation deal, which is what the sources are saying, is that over the last month, the U.S. has been quietly sitting Ukrainians down and saying to the officials and saying it's time to consider a peace negotiation. You're not making any inroads on the battlefield. And so 1 round, 2 rounds, we've already seen what happens with these pushbacks. What's another 3 or 4 rounds? It's probably not going to make any real difference. But there is still this pledging of support, these promises to Ukraine, because what else are we going to do? I mean, the powers that be promised Ukraine, we're with you to the end until we defeat Russia. So we're going to stick with you as long as it takes until Russia's defeated. And then suddenly, really quickly, actually, this was, you look at the war in Afghanistan, 20 years, you look at all of the various different wars that we've engaged in around the world, and they lasted a lot longer than a year and a half. But this one was very short, and already people are flipping, and it's because of what's going on in Israel, and potentially the realization that this could cause China to do something about Taiwan, in which case the U.S. would be spread very, very thin. I want to explain why. There's a lot of misinformation as to why Egypt doesn't want the Palestinians. I'm seeing this circulating on social media. Egypt doesn't want the Palestinians. The Arab nations won't take them. This is how bad and awful they are. They're so bad and awful that other Arab nations won't take them. That is absolutely not true. And I'm going to explain why Egypt rejects taking Palestinian refugees, why Arab nations reject taking Palestinian refugees. First, here is the tweet from Reuters saying Egypt has discussed plans with the United States and others to provide humanitarian aid through its border with Gaza Strip, but rejects any move to set up safe corridors for refugees fleeing the enclave, Egyptian security sources said. So people are like, oh my gosh, you got 2 different camps of people, right? One camp is saying this is terrible. These people have nowhere to go and they're just going to die in the Gaza Strip because Egypt won't reach out and give them humanitarian assistance by bringing in the refugees. The other camp of people say, well, see, look at how awful the Palestinians must be. They're all terrorists, so bad that even Egypt will not take them. In fact, I want to show you this tweet from Dave Rubin. We got into a bit of a back and forth on this. He says, when Israel bombs the F out of Gaza, which it should for however long it takes, remember that Egypt, which shares a border with Gaza, won't let one Palestinian in. Actually, they've bombed the border and flooded tunnels to keep their Palestinian brothers out. I did respond to this. This was just a few days ago, but I have more to add to this. This is just one angle of it. I said, it isn't because they don't want them, because they think they're awful people or whatever it is you're implying. It's because they know every single one of them, all 2 million, would rush into Egypt to escape the hell Israel created for them. No nation wants millions at their border clamoring to flood in, right? I mean, we have that problem with our border. We cannot take in all of these people. Egypt certainly cannot suddenly take in 2 million people. He then wrote, Kim, before 1967, what country was Gaza part of? Was that an occupation of Palestine? Israel didn't create the hell. Not one Israeli lives there, and Egypt has the blockade too. I'm implying exactly what I said. They don't want them, nor does any other nation. Maybe you want to invite a family to live with you instead of virtue signaling. There's never been a nation known as Palestine, and now there clearly never will be. I get as a leftist, you aren't very bright, but learn some basic history. So, I don't know why he had to insult me. But hey, he called me a leftist. I think he's the only person in the world who thinks I'm a leftist. Also, I'm an independent, by the way. I'm not, I lean left, I would say, but I'm independent maybe, but many people think I'm a big right winger. I don't know. I don't know why you said virtue signaling by saying bringing in, I clearly said people can't handle the borders. So I'm not saying open borders, let them all in. So I don't know. It's just an emotional conversation, but let me break this down a little bit more. The idea that these other Arab nations don't want them is not true. You have to remember what this war is about. This war is about existence on the land. Israel wants nothing more than for the Palestinians to flee. They would love it because it would be a de facto win for Israel if every Palestinian packed their bags and ran into Egypt. Then what? The land is free and clear. Israel then has the land. Mission accomplished, war is won. Same thing with the West Bank. If you push them all into Jordan or push them all into these other Arab nations, that is what Israel wants. All of these Arab nations know this, and the Palestinian people know this as well. First of all, you're not seeing gobs and gobs of people at the Egyptian border. The Palestinians are not clamoring at the border trying to get into Egypt. They're resisting. Their way of fighting this war, obviously, you've got Hamas, and they've been able to get some rockets. But the vast majority of the Palestinian people, the way they view this war with the Israelis is that they are resisting by existing, by simply still being there on that land and saying, you do not get to take our land. That is how they're battling, just by existing, by still remaining there. So the vast majority of the Palestinians are not going to run off into other nations because they believe that part of the battle is just remaining still, standing your ground in your spot and saying, this land is mine and you're not going to steal it from me. So Israel wants nothing more than for these Arab nations to open up their borders. And let me tell you exactly what Israel would do in this instance. So what they want is they want Egypt to say, fine, we will take the refugees in. Israel would then start at the very top of the Gaza Strip, and they would start bombing. They would call the Palestinians. This time they would give them maybe the knock on the roof or the phone call saying, we're about to bomb you, get out. And they would start bombing row by row by row, starting at the top of that Gaza Strip, pushing the people, herding the people towards the Egyptian border. Meanwhile, carpet bombing and leveling the place, pushing the people closer and closer to that Egyptian border, bombing and bombing and bombing and pushing and pushing and bombing and pushing until all the people are at the border, at the Rafah crossing. And then what do? Then you start bombing the Rafah crossing. You start bombing them even more to get them to really run, get them to run into Egypt. And once they run into Egypt, because Egypt's opened up the humanitarian corridor, you're done. You've won the war. The people are gone. And in the process, you've leveled the place. You were going to build new buildings anyway. So you've done a bunch of land clearing, and now you're going to rebuild new buildings, and it's just the home for Israelis. And now all the Palestinians are gone. So many have asked a lot of these Gazans, why don't you go? Many of them say, well, for one, we can't. But if we did, would we be allowed to return? Can you guarantee that I would be able to come back? And that answer is no. There are refugee camps all throughout Arab nations, as it is right now, where Palestinians have been shoved out. They're living in refugee camps in Jordan or wherever in these various different Arab nations. And Israel will not take those refugees back. They're saying that they do not have the right to return to the land. They're not going to let them in. And every Palestinian knows this. They know once they leave, there will never be any coming back. So it is in Israel's best interest for Egypt to open up the border and to let the Palestinians in. They would love nothing more, and they would begin their bombing campaign to herd all the people across the border. Egypt knows this. So they've actually said, Egypt says Israel seeks to empty Gaza and rejects corridors for civilians. Cairo says it will allow aid to be delivered through its border to Gaza after closing it to civilians fleeing the war. One of the Egyptian security sources told Reuters news agency that Egypt rejected the idea of safe corridors for civilians to protect the right of Palestinians to hold on to their cause and their land. The Israeli occupation has sought throughout the conflict to try and resettle the people of Gaza in Sinai, adding that it was forcing Palestinians to choose between death or their land. So the Arab nations know this, and they're also in a battle with Israel. And they're saying, no, we're not going to take them. You have to come to an agreement with them. You need to give them a nation. You need to give them the land. You don't get to take it. So no, we're not going to unburden you from what you've been trying to accomplish for decades. We're not going to do it. And the minute we say we will, there would be an international push to move the Palestinian people, and Israel wins. So Egypt, they say, this is the president of Egypt. He actually gave a statement as well, and he says Egypt hopes for a resolution of the Palestinian cause through negotiations leading to a just peace and the establishment of a Palestinian state. So this is why. So when you see the social media circulating around and you hear this narrative of these Arab nations won't take the Palestinians, this is how bad the Palestinians are, they're such awful people that other Arab nations won't take them. For one, the Palestinians aren't asking to go. They're asking to stay. They want the land. They're fighting for their right to have the land that they believe is theirs, that they believe is being stolen from them. So they're not asking to go, for one. But two, the Arab nations say, yeah, you wish. You would love nothing more than for that outcome, wouldn't you, Israel? Then you get all the land for yourself and problem solved. So I just wanted to clarify exactly what is really going on there, what the truth is about the Arab nations or Egypt not accepting the refugees. What the real reason is for that is because they're saying to Israel, no, if you're going to bomb these people and kill them off, that is on you. And the rest of the world will watch in horror, and you will be condemned. And Israel knows this. You will be condemned if you do that to all of these people. So you're going to have to come up with a different solution other than eradicating them one way or another. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Robert, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Kim.
Does this give you second thoughts about running as a Democrat? That's my big criticism about your campaign, is that you're running as a Democrat. You won't give it up. I feel like you should run as an independent. They're not going to give you the platform and the time that you deserve, especially for a party that claims they're all about democracy. This seems to be antithetical to democracy. How are you going to get around this blockade that they're clearly putting up?
Well, I will point out that if I did run as an independent, there are no primaries there, and there are no debates either. But I'm running. The Democratic Party is my home. I feel like the Democratic Party has lost its bearings. It's become the war party. It's become the party of censorship. It's become the party of corporate control and big pharma. It's become the party of fear, and that I need to do whatever I can to reclaim the party to what it used to be, the party of JFK, of FDR, of Robert Kennedy. And so I'm very peaceful with the choice that I've made. I hope that President Biden will change his mind, and that he will engage in debates and some or town halls or retail politics.
Do you ever think that maybe you should have run as a Republican? And I say this because I feel like you would maybe have a better shot at actually going further on using the Republican Party the way that Trump used it. I don't think he was a true Republican. In fact, he was a Democrat for a long time, switched because he figured it would be easier to infiltrate that party and actually be able to get the nomination, which he was right. He was able to do that. And in doing that, we've seen a shift on the Republican side of the aisle where topics that were never, ever popular with the GOP are suddenly popular. Things like wanting to end wars, going against corporate capture of the government. These are things that, even though the establishment GOP hasn't really, they're definitely pushing back on, they're definitely doing everything they can to halt the populism, the rise of populism on the Republican side. But it's malleable. There's room there. And they do seem to have a more democratic process. So what did you even consider possibly, because many of your messages, I think, resonate not just with Democrats. We've seen your polling numbers increase on the Democratic side with voters that voted for Joe Biden. Now, do you have the latest on that? I know that they went from 10% to 14%. I'm sure they're just climbing, which is probably why Democrats are saying no debates. We don't want any debates. We don't want any actual challenge. But you do have a lot of support from independents, from Republicans, and running as a Democrat. There's a lot of Republicans that aren't going to switch over to the Democratic Party in order to vote in the primary. Some states it's open, but other states it's not. So did you even maybe consider that? Because you do have so much support on both sides of the aisle, actually, and especially amongst independents.
No, I really feel, Kim, like I need to reclaim the Democratic Party, and I feel like I have an opportunity to maybe do the same thing with the Democratic Party that Trump did with the Republican Party, which is to remind it of its populist roots and to reinvigorate the Democratic Party as a populist party. So that's and I think that's important. I think that the path that the Democratic Party is on right now is a bad path. I think that it's shocking to me that it's become the war party. I mean, they're both parties of the war party, and that it's the party promoting censorship. And the word liberal means freedom of speech, and yet President Biden and in the advertisement the announcement that he released today, the big issue in it was freedom of speech. And I think we really do need freedom of speech, and that was that's ironic, but I'm glad that President Biden reminded us that that's an important value of the Democratic Party, and I hope that I can continue to remind Democrats of their roots.
Well, one way that Trump was able to actually make change in the Republican Party was that he got so much media attention in 2016, leading up to the 2016 election. And that is not what's happening for you. They're suppressing information. In fact, Reuters, I'm sure you saw this ridiculous article that they came out with titled Fact Box 2024 US Presidential Election, who's in, who's out, and who's still thinking about it. They list all of these candidates. Everybody's name is in bold. Then your name pops up and suddenly your name's not in bold. Yours is the only one whose name is not in bold. Everyone else's is in bold. And then they also just completely left out Marianne Williamson, who's also running on the in the Democratic Party. So they're not going to give you the media attention. They're not going to even entertain in the way that they did for Trump in 2016. So, the media blockade is going to be a big thing that is going to be difficult to get around. And now we're even seeing, like, with Tucker Carlson being fired from Fox News, I'm sure that would have been a show you would have been invited on, and you've been, to help boost your campaign. Now that's gone. I suspect largely because he platforms people like Trump, like yourself, like others who are genuinely challenging the establishment. So it's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult, I think. But I'm really hopeful for you and your campaign. I definitely I see that people are from both sides of the aisle very much enthusiastic about you and the policies that you stand for that are very, very different from what we're hearing from the establishment. I think that's they're no longer a Democratic Party, despite the name, and this is a very purposeful. I don't think it's anything about optics. I don't think they want a true democracy, and I don't think they have for a really long time. Actually, when we go back and look through the party and how the party's operated. I don't think that they hold. I mean, even you go back to the 60s and it's, they'll just put in a candidate and say, we don't care what the people want. This is the person that we're putting in. So, yeah, I mean, I think it goes beyond optics. But, look, thank you so much for being here. And best of luck running as a Democrat. You know how I feel about that. One thing that I do have to ask you before we end this is in the end, and this is what happened in 2020, in the end, when they say, well, Joe Biden's the candidate and that's it, are you going to endorse him for president when
Well,
you decide, if you decide you're not going to run?
I'm in it to win it. So I'm not thinking of a plan B.
Okay. My only advice is don't do that. If it comes down to that, and the Democratic Party is just saying, we're not going to put you on the ticket, and that's that, don't endorse Joe Biden, pivot, go independent, but the last thing you should do is say, yeah, this is okay, fine, concede. Don't do it. That's just the one thing that I would say. But I
How come
definitely.
how come, how come you have
Go
no
ahead.
faith in my candidacy, Kim?
I don't have any faith in the Democratic Party. I have a lot of faith in your campaign. I have no faith at all, zero, zilch, none in the Democratic Party. I don't think that they're going to allow you to become the candidate. I think that they've already shown that, and they're going to put Joe Biden on the ticket, and none of us are going to have a choice about it. I think the only thing you could do is your campaign could continue to grow in momentum, of course, which you are. That would be challenging to the Democratic Party, but they will ensure that the establishment media suppresses that information so that they don't see that you're actually growing, because they know that that would have an avalanche effect, that when people start to see that you're actually growing in the polls and that more people are interested in your message, then others are wanting to check that out. They're going to suppress that. I just have no faith at all in them. So I think it's inevitable that Joe Biden's going to end up being the candidate, and you're going to have to pivot. And that might not be such a bad thing. I think ultimately you could win this. I don't know if on the Democratic ticket, I get it. Dennis Kucinich is the same way. He doesn't want to give up the Democratic Party, but I think the Democratic Party gave you up. And so what are you going to do? They broke up with you. You at some point have to accept it. And this is one of those times, I think that, but hey, the challenge is helpful for press, I think, to continue challenging Joe Biden. I do think that helps from a media perspective. Of course, they want to see, oh, this, you're being censored, you're being silenced, you're not being allowed onto a debate stage with him. So I think that is actually good for your campaign for a while, but then there's going to be a period of time when it isn't. And I hope you pivot. That's what I'm hoping. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, well, I'm hoping you're not such a great soothsayer, Kim, and that the
I understand. I totally get it. I get your perspective. I'm a realist. That's who I am. So, but yeah.
Look, you make a compelling argument, and I hope that the situation in our country is not as grim as you portray it, but it may be. We'll see.
I do think they're actually going to be getting rid of Joe Biden. I don't think he's going to be the nominee in 2024, but I also don't think they want to have an election. I certainly don't think they want to risk someone like RFK Jr. winning. So I think the way they're going to do it is they're going to act like Biden is the guy all the way up through the primaries. When the primaries are over, they're still going to say Biden's the guy, that he defeated handedly RFK Jr. and Marianne Williamson, and that Joe Biden is obviously the nominee. And then right before the convention, I think they're going to be moving him aside. And they're going to be actually, in my guess, if I were a betting woman, I would say that they're going to be putting in Gavin Newsom is how they're going to do it. And the way they're going to do this, look, they don't want to have an election. They're not interested in an election, a primary. They just want to put in who they want to put in, because they don't want to risk somebody, like I mentioned, RFK Jr., winning that nomination. They don't want to have an actual battle of Democrats. They don't want to have debates with RFK Jr. and Gavin Newsom or whoever else might be Cory Booker or whoever, Kamala, maybe she's, I still want to try, or whoever else they think might be trying to run for president, Pete Buttigieg, whoever it might be. They don't want to actually have those debates. They don't want to actually have a primary. They just want to put in the person they want to put in. And we saw that even with Joe Biden himself getting the nomination the last time around. And we saw when they chose Kamala Harris, they tried to shove her down our throats. They were saying, this is the next president of the United States. We're finally going to have a woman. She's going to be a woman of color. and you're going to like it. And so they were trying to parlay her into the presidency through the vice presidency, but it didn't work because nobody liked Kamala Harris. And when she got into that role, people liked her even less and less and less. And they saw that she has no leadership skills whatsoever when it comes to leading a country. And her approval ratings have just absolutely tanked. She's less likable than even Joe Biden, if that's even possible. So they need to get rid of both of them. They're not going to be able to just move Biden aside. They're not going to be able to, they're in a pickle because they can't replace Kamala Harris as his running mate. Who would they replace her with? And that looks terrible to replace after they tout it, they're propping up, we've got the woman of color. There's no way they could replace her. They'd have to find another woman of color. And even then it'd be very awkward. I mean, maybe they tossed around in their minds, Stacey Abrams maybe in their minds, but again, not a national figure that people identify with or gravitate to. They've tried. So how are they going to get out of this dilemma that they're in? How are they going to get Joe Biden to move aside, get Kamala Harris to move aside, and get somebody else in? And their only strategy is to not hold a primary, but instead go straight to the convention, have Joe Biden suddenly, he says, okay, there's just too much going on with my family. I need to worry about my son and my family and my life. And so I am not going to run for another term. I'm sorry. You all expected me to. I know. Thank you. Love you. But I'm not going to be seeking a second term. Now, he's not going to step down because then that would mean Kamala Harris steps in, right? And they don't want that. So they're going to want him to ride out his term all the way to the end. But what they're going to want to do come that July convention is they're going to want him, after they give them the anointed one, their next anointed one, they're going to want him to campaign alongside that person, shaking hands, waving, saying, this is, I'm just getting too old. I said I would only do one term. Now I'm really thinking about that and realizing it. So I'm going to keep my promise. And here's the new person. Here's Gavin Newsom. And I want everybody to vote for Gavin Newsom. And he's the guy. He's the one we want. He's the one we love because he's super ultra establishment. And he's clearly the one that they have picked to succeed Joe Biden. And it's their way of getting rid of Kamala Harris. Why? Because you can't have two of them from California, right? So it's going to be awkward. And Gavin Newsom's going to say, well, I'm from California, and so I need to get somebody from the East Coast. It's going to be a big chatter on CNN. You can see it now. Oh, well, they can't go with Kamala Harris. They can't have two people from California. They do need to have representation if they're going to be fair to the East Coast or Midwest representation. And so they're going to need to find a different person to be Gavin Newsom's running mate. And Kamala Harris will say, for the good of the country, I agree that we really need representation. That's what America's about. And so both of us being from the West Coast and California, it just doesn't make sense. So I'm happy to move on with my life. And this was fun and this was great, but I'm moving on. So she'll get to bow out gracefully somewhat. Joe Biden will get to bow out gracefully. They'll be able to bring Gavin Newsom in without a vote. And this is where it gets important. How can they do that? Well, they don't need to have a vote. All they have to do is show up at the convention and they could say the delegates are voting. And these are, they'll have this kind of pretend thing. So they'll be able to sidestep all the state's primaries. And they'll have the convention. And at the convention, they'll say, oh, gee, Joe Biden's stepping aside. Now it's a scramble and the primaries are over, so we can't have the people vote. So we, the DNC, have come up with a few candidate options, and we're going to let the delegates vote on those few candidate options. And they're going to play around with it and make it seem like it's a real, true Democratic vote, even though the people aren't voting at all. It's just the delegates. And they're going to ensure that, I'm telling you, I think it's Gavin Newsom. That is who they're going to put into that position. I could be somebody else, I suppose. I don't know how in love with him they really are. I think they just want somebody establishment.
Thank you guys so much for watching The Kim Iverson Show throughout 2023. So whether you were here with us from day one when we launched on January 2nd, or whether you joined us somewhere in the middle, We did see a lot of growth this year as a show, and we hope 2024 is even a better year. We hope that more people discover independent media bringing forward different perspectives than the approved establishment narratives, and nowhere better to do that than Free Speech Rumble. So we really appreciate that, and we hope that we see a lot more growth. So we will be back New Year's Day, Monday, January 1st, with a fresh show to kick off the new year. I hope that you have a great weekend. Make the most of what's left of 2023, and we will see you next year. Good night.